In the last lecture, we have looked at how historians down the ages have looked at the revolutionary transformation of industrial sector in modern Europe, and they have dealt with the question to what extent the transformation itself was revolutionary or whether it was evolutionary. In today's lecture, we would look at how the historians have dealt with the question whether the industrial transformation should necessarily have begun in Britain and not elsewhere, meaning why did it begin in Britain and not elsewhere, and why in the second half of the 18th century rather than at any other time. So some historians, for instance, have looked at this question from the perspective of the British weather, and some say that industrial revolution became possible because of the unique weather situation in Great Britain, or rather the climatic character of the British Isles. Such an argument, however, fails to look at the question as to why other areas of Europe which had similar climatic features did not experience the same kind of industrial transformation. Another lot of historians, for instance, would argue that the major break that took place in the Industrial Revolution was made possible because of the natural endowment of coal, the resources of coal in the British Isles. That also fails to account for why other parts of Europe, which had much richer, sometimes much richer mineral endowments, especially coal deposits, such as in Silesia, such as in Alsace and Lorraine, why such transformation did not take place. Europe was beginning to be a vortex of a global commerce where the wings of commerce, as it were spread from the New World on the west to Asia on the east. And in this process, the center of European commerce, the center of European global domination happened to be, in course of the 17th century, the Netherlands. Towards the beginning of the 17th century, Antwerp was replaced by Amsterdam as the hub from which global commerce was being dictated. And this had, as I have mentioned, two wings. There were the colonial possessions in Asia and the colonial possessions in the New World that were held by the various European powers, which proved decisive. By the end of the 17th century, however, on the back of the colonial commerce that was predominating, Britain and France began to replace the Netherlands as the hub of Europe-based global commerce that was doing the rounds. Towards the beginning of the 18th century, Amsterdam gradually began to be replaced by London as a global destination of capital, as more and more shipping and more export and re-export business began to take place from London rather than Amsterdam. Great Britain emerged in the forefront of European commercial landscape. The outcome of this was, apart from a gradual diminution of the significance of Amsterdam, whose principal importance in the European landscape happened to be monitoring or functioning as the entrepot of the agricultural commerce from the eastern part of Europe and the global colonial commerce from all the other parts of the world. From this kind of a trade, the emphasis shifted to London, where colonial commerce began to play a very important role. So on the one hand, imports from Asia and imports from America used to come to London, from where they would be re-exported, again in different parts of the globe. Some of the crucial factors of this, some of the crucial contents of this trade happened to be, for instance, Asiatic tea, which would come to London and then would be re-exported to the New World, which were to be basically later the United States of America. And on the other hand, commerce by way of molasses, by way of plantation economy, plantation stuff such as sugarcane, these would be imported from the New World and would be re-exported then to Europe. This was one wing of the the British trade that was taking place vis-a-vis the colonial possessions. The other dimension, of course, was export of British manufactures to other parts of the world, which was in this particular case predominantly Europe. By the beginning of the 18th century, however, an important change was taking place in the character of colonial commerce. In the early part of the 18th century, one of the commodities that began to dominate the European commercial landscape happened to be Indian textiles. The demand for Indian textiles reached such a proportion that it was beginning to be realized that the colonial dimension of the trade could be both a threat and an opportunity. Opportunity was the way the European merchants would tend to look at it. So, they would bring in materials from India and then they would re-export them to Europe with a whopping profit, with a substantial profit margin. And precisely because such items tended to be of luxury usage, it was generally a high profit making venture. On the other hand, colonial commerce also began to pose a threat to European industry, because the Indian textiles had the potential of dislocating and disrupting the market that the European producers had already geared for themselves. In the year 1700, the threat began to loom so large that at one stage the British textile industry imposed or got the government to impose a ban on the import of calicos. The dual character of the Indian colonial connection then presented before the British manufacturing, in fact the European manufacturing industry, a very significant question as to they had two alternatives. Either the British would limit themselves to extremely select, extremely skilled artisanal products for luxury consumption, or they would go for the low value mass market that was beginning to emerge. And by the middle of the 18th century, the decision that seemed to have been taken almost unanimously across the board in the European manufacturing sector was that as far as possible luxury items had to be kept out by way of import restrictions, and as far as possible the mass market was to be attempted at. The general problem, however, in this particular type of production was that the cost of production had to be reduced in order to stay competitive, because if the value of a particular commodity is low, then the profit margin also tends to be low. In that case, the larger market you are able to grab, the better. The solution in this particular case that was resolved was mechanization. However, mechanization being a very capital intensive process, it was very difficult for the artisans who were associated with the proto-industrial mode of production to carry it out. The guild was unwilling to change its mode of production in any way. So, a transformation was in order. The transformation had to come by way of the merchant taking a greater interest in the production process itself. In case of Britain, the advantage lay in the fact that in the British Isles, the customs barriers that characterized almost every other European state, the inland customs barriers did not exist for historical reasons. So, in the 18th century, the situation as it stood was that Britain had the single largest market available in the whole of Europe. There being no inland customs barriers, goods could travel from one part of the British Isles to the other without paying any customs or transit dues. Compare that with the situation in France, for instance. The Kingdom of France had 36 generalités or provinces, each with its own customs barrier. So, by the time a commodity that was produced in the northern part of France would reach the southern part of France, at every stage, at every generalite it would pass through, a new duty would be imposed on it. So, the price that was there at the point of origin and the price at the point of actual sale would be considerably different. It would be far higher. As a result, French domestic production remained confined essentially within the provincial boundaries. Compare the situation, for instance, with the German case. In the 18th century, there was no Germany. There were 300 odd German princely states, bishoprics, city-states, independent republics, each as sort of loose association with the Holy Roman Empire, but each also with a fairly autonomous existence. What this implied was that each of these 300 odd German states and principalities and city-states had their own customs barrier, had their own currencies, had their own weights and measures, and had their own legal system. So, the outcome was that if a commodity had to move from one part of the German lands to another, let us say from the southern parts of Germany, say somewhere in Bavaria, to somewhere in the north, in Prussia or Mecklenburg, it had to pass through a number of states on the way, and at each stage it had to pay some kind of customs duty or some kind of transit duty. Till the early 18th century, both France and Britain moved primarily on the basis of charcoal. Charcoal was the principal source of inanimate source of energy. Generally, the animate source of energy used to be more in vogue because it simply made operational advantages greater. In the British case, the advantage happened to be what initially appeared to be actually a disadvantage. The British charcoal reserves were not as abundant as they were, say, in France or in Germany. So, if an inanimate source of energy is required, the French would simply go and chop the trees, and Germans would simply go and chop the trees, and they had so much they could chop away, and that was the cheapest source of energy. Coal, by comparison, although it was abundant, was more expensive. In case of the British Isles, what happened was that the forest cover began to be depleted in course of the 17th and early 18th century, so much so that by the middle of the 18th century, charcoal was actually becoming a scarce resource. So, in the 18th century, in the middle of the 18th century, the British began to play with an alternative, which happened to be coal. And coal had some basic advantages, unlike charcoal. For instance, if you are smelting iron, charcoal leaves much greater volume of impurities in it. Coal leaves far fewer. As a result, metal produced by coal based furnaces are stronger. So, the British had not only the advantage of having a steady market, they also had the advantage of resource base comparative to the French. What emerged as a paucity of charcoal, what emerged as a disadvantage, the paucity of charcoal, actually it was turned into an advantage because of the relative cheapness of coal that began to emerge in the second half of the 19th century. In the beginning of the 18th century, the British transportation system was considered to be the most primitive in the whole of Europe. British roads were known for their poor condition they were in, largely because these were maintained by the state. By the early 18th century, however, this thing began to change. From the early 18th century, a series of new bodies began to emerge known as the turnpike bodies, turnpike trusts as they were called, who began to adopt or who began to sort of acquire charter from the British Parliament, which authorized local individuals or groups of individuals to form a turnpike trust, who would then manufacture, who would then prepare a road, who would construct a road and would be responsible for its maintenance. In return for this, the idea was that they would get something like the tolls. They would tax on the usage of the turnpike roads. Now, in this manner, the turnpike trusts began to build roads far better in quality than in the early part of the 18th century. And by the middle of the 18th century, in fact, almost all major roads leading into the capital, London, happened to be turnpike roads. Similarly, there was the other advantage that Britain had was a very well developed navigation system. By the 18th century, Britain had several canals that were dug, first under state initiative, then subsequently also under turnpike trusts, as larger parts of Britain began to be sort of better interconnected with roadways and with canals connecting the whole of the British Isles together. The size of the market suddenly grew exponentially. It became very cheap in the second half of the 18th century for goods to be transported from one part of Britain to another, either by the navigable waterways or by well-paved roadways. In course of the 18th century, one of the most significant, most dramatic changes that affected British economy and British social life was what Phyllis Dean calls the demographic revolution. Till 1740, the British population seldom grew at a rate faster than 0.5 to 1%, because quite often natural disasters, warfare, famines and bad harvest, an undisturbed growth in its population. The birth rate, for various different reasons, tended to always rise higher than the death rate. As a result, with the adequate food being available to a large section of the population of England and Wales increased at a rate of 3.5% all through the 1750s, after remaining stuck at 6 million for over 4 decades. The average rate of growth continued to increase. In the 1760s, it climbed up to 7%, and it stood at an average of 11% between 1780 and 1810, and pushing the total population past the 9 million mark. Imagine that. There is a 50% growth in a matter of just 70 years. From 6 million in 1740, the population becomes 9 million in 1810. This was possible because, as Phyllis Dean says, that around this time England began to undergo what was known as the agricultural revolution. Because of this growing population meant a growing demand for food. However, in England, there was a standing problem from the 16th, 17th century onwards, is that in order to provide the woolen textile industry with all possible resources, the British had started with a practice of enclosures. So they would enclose agricultural land and turn it over to animal husbandry, to sheep raising, which meant that less and less agricultural land was available to the British economy, which also meant that Britain had to go for intensive cultivation rather than extensive cultivation. It could not expand the area under cultivation, so it had to increase productivity per unit of land. As population began to grow in the 1740s, this urge to grow more crops per unit of land began to increase. And in the first half of the 18th century, several innovations actually helped in this process. Jethro Tull's innovation, for instance, helped the process of continual cultivation of land, and that began to generate greater surplus of food. Once it was possible to increase productivity per unit of land, the Parliament also began to help by enclosing lands for the first time for the purpose of agriculture rather than animal husbandry. So, on the one hand, while lands were enclosed for animal husbandry in order to feed the woolen textile industry, other lands were being enclosed to generate more and more crop, to produce more and more crop. And as the per unit productivity of land began to grow, this was turning out to be a profitable proposition. In the 1740s, agriculture becomes an even more profitable proposition with the invention of the Rotterdam plough, which is basically which inserts an iron tip on top of plough, which helps the land to be furrowed deeper. As seeds would be burrowed deeper, as fertile land would sort of be churned out, the harvest that ends up being reaped is much bountiful than earlier. So, more and more food was available. As more and more food began to be available, people tended to live longer, and that is where the demographic revolution ultimately actually grew. The real factor, however, is that the growing population, the growing availability of food makes certain that the population continues to grow. The population, as it is growing, generates a bigger demand, and the sector that ultimately leads Britain into industrial revolution, the cotton textile industry, had the advantage of having to clothe a huge body of people. As the population rises, shoots up from 6 million to 9 million people, a 50% jump, just imagine the opportunities available. This demand for clothing 9 million people it represents such a surge that the old guild-based system could not respond to it. And responding to this demand, the merchants moved in with their proto-industrial infrastructure, and they just started installing machinery that would help produce yarn at a cheaper price, and then they would help weave a cloth at a cheaper rate. So, they were insisting on reducing the cost per unit of production, which is where the machinery comes in. They were also eager to expand production, which is where reliance moves away from artisanal production into mechanized industrial production. And in so doing, the foundations were laid for the British textile industry to simply take off in a mechanized, in a modern factory setting. So, the British Industrial Revolution, the industrial transformation, the transformation from artisanal production, from cottage-based production to technology-driven factory-based production, takes place at a very convenient time for Great Britain, which, because of the conjunction of factors in the late 18th century, could not happen before it because population was not nearly as high, did not need to happen after it because the timing was just right. For any other European society, in the German lands for instance, there was no German market. There was not even any idea that there could be a German market. So, the people who were located in the southern part of Germany were keener to trade with the northern part of France, which was adjacent, far fewer customs barriers to overcome than to go in the northern part of Germany. The people who inhabited the northern part of Germany would find their natural trading partners on the other side of the North Sea, Britain for instance, Scandinavia for instance. But the market size was naturally very limited, very confined to their immediate environment and to whatever geographical region was adjacent to it. Britain overcame this problem because it had a large and expanding domestic market, which made innovation profitable, because investing in technology helps you cut per unit cost of production. Merchants were more eager to invest in technology in Britain than they were elsewhere, knowing fully well that if they would produce a larger quantity of merchandise at a cheaper price, then they would have a growing mass market to cater to that was not there in France or in Germany or any other part of Europe. This therefore is the sum and substance of the reason why industrial transformation in the second half of the 18th century begins in Britain and nowhere else, and it begins in the second half of the 18th century and at no other time.